Здравствуйте, добрый вечер. Очень рада вас видеть.
Hello, good evening. I'm happy to see
Кто был
you.
на выставке?
Who has seen the
Я всегда
exhibition?
спрашиваю. Молодцы, какие
I
вы
always
хорошие.
ask the
Меня
audience this
зовут
question.
Снежана
My
Крыстева,
name
я
is
куратор
Snezhana Kristeva. I'm a
выставки, которую
curator
вы видели
of
вместе с
the
Екатериной Лазарев.
exhibition that you have
И
seen. I
мы
created it together
подготовили,
with
да, достаточно
Ekатерina
такую
Lazareva.
интенсивную
So
публичную
we
программу, в рамках
prepared a very
которой
intensive
сегодняшняя
public
лекция.
program for this exhibition, The
Я
Coming
очень
World.
рада,
And this
что к
lecture
нам
that you're
пришел DJ
going
Demos. Я не
to
буду
hear
его,
today
вы,
is
наверное,
going
все
to be
знаете,
part
кто,
of
не
this
буду его
public
презентовать.
program.
Сегодня
I'm
лекция,
not
он
going
сказал,
to
что будет
introduce
очень
DJ
ого, это
Demos
новый материал.
because you know him very well,
И
and
он
he
очень бы
said
хотел,
that
конечно, услышать
he's going
от
to
вас
present some
в
new
конце,
material,
это
so he
может
would
быть длиться где-то
welcome
около
your
часа его
comments.
лекция,
His
и
lecture would
после этого
last
очень бы хотелось,
about
чтобы
1
вы,
hour,
конечно,
so your
задали какие-то
questions
вопросы,
would
и
be welcome
какая-то
after the lecture,
дискуссия
so
ведется.
that we could have some discussion.
Вот, и на этом я как бы закончу
And
свое интро.
now
Хочу
I'm going
еще в конце
to give
сказать
him the
большое
floor and
спасибо
finish the
компании
introduction
Сибур за
here. I
поддержку
also
этой лекции.
wanted to thank Sibur
So,
Company for supporting this
welcome.
lecture.
Basically, I said how amazing you are, and and that at the end of your lecture, we would really like to have a Q&A. So please do think of questions, and obviously we won't force you, but yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks to the garage and everyone who helped with this trip for the invitation. It's great to be here, and thanks everyone for coming. We can put the the image of from my presentation on. This should be about an hour, and I'm happy to discuss and address questions and concerns afterwards. It's some difficult material that I'll be presenting, but that's the condition, that's the situation that we're in. So the politics and aesthetics of climate emergency. I'm really happy to give this presentation in the context also of the exhibition that's up here, because there's a lot of really resonant and compelling, challenging work in the show. I'm going to be focusing a bit more on social movements and activism, as you'll see. But I don't think it's, it hopefully will add something productive and critical to the discussion. So it's also a bit in reference to politics largely in North America and the States where I'm from, and I'm hoping this will translate. We'll see. If you have questions about that, again, we can discuss afterwards. So I'm coming from the University of California at Santa Cruz, where I teach and write and also direct this Center for Creative Ecologies, which I set up when I moved from London to Santa Cruz in 2015. We're currently working on a project, a research exhibition, screening series, and more. 2-year project, and that will culminate in the next year with a lot of activities. The website is nearly ready. I don't think it's live yet, but it's the research project is dedicated to the question of what comes after the end of the world. Meaning, how do we conceive the end of the world? What is a world? Whose end is it? And how do we get beyond, in other words, the kind of debilitating catastrophism and negativity that is so pervasive today in relationship to just the continual stream of dystopian outlooks in relationship to political and economic and social and ecological conditions that we face today. So how can we cultivate futures of justice and multi-species flourishing? And how can we, through research, writing, teaching, sharing, discussions, activism, how can we bring into being new kinds of worlds? So we're told that we're living in emergency times, but the question is, I want to ask, whose emergency? It's a key question, especially when one's emergency can mean another's oppression, one's security, another's erasure, one's tragedy, another's economic opportunity. For Extinction Rebellion, and this is a broad. I'll introduce this movement if you're not familiar with it, but it's really, it's less than a year old, and it's really a crucial, growing international environmentalist social movement that's taken off these days. So for them, for Extinction Rebellion, it's an emergency of atmospheric carbon impacting everyone, humans and more than human, with a decade before cascading tipping points. They cite this 2018 IPCC report. This is the UN Climate Science Organization that states we have 12 years to limit climate change catastrophe, to mitigate extreme heat, drought, floods, and massive suffering. Consequently, cities all over the world have declared climate emergencies, although you notice from this map it's largely in the global north, in the US, Canada, in the EU, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. For them, the future itself is at stake. For XR, or Extinction Rebellion, XR, the time for denial is over. It's time to act. Meanwhile, Indigenous activists, people of First Nations, and again, I'm thinking of groups and communities in North America, but also throughout the Americas. So Indigenous activists insist they've been living in emergency times since 1492, with waves of colonial violence unfolding over hundreds of years, their history being equal to, or worse even, than the IPCC's near future. For frontline communities living in sacrifice zones and toxic wastelands, emergency is a matter of colonial oppression that continues in the present, pushing climate change back centuries. For Larry Gross, for instance, who's a member of the Anishinaabe Nation, Native Americans have already seen the end of their respective worlds. Indians have already survived the apocalypse. Indeed, the Anthropocene is another name for colonial genocide, for land grabs, cultural assimilation, forced labor. And to sever these relations, denying the full scope of Indigenous emergency, is to potentially reenact domination. Still other emergencies are called out in recent social justice activism. Around economic inequality, militarization, white supremacy, migrant detention centers, and borderization. These have also inspired recent protests against art institutions, in some ways building on the movement to liberate museums from fossil fuel funding. For instance, with the recent actions against cultural philanthropists like Warren B. Canders and the Sackler family. Again, this is in the US. And yes, I do know where I'm speaking. Climate emergency in these cases designates sites of chemical warfare, whether conducted through opioid addiction, pharmaceutical products that are highly addictive, painkillers that have had really disastrous effects in North America, or weaponized atmospheres of tear gas. It also identifies securitized environments of climate migration. For instance, in protests targeting the 2014 Sydney biennial in Australia, opposing its financial connections to Transfield, the for-profit corporation that runs a migrant detention center on behalf of Australia on the islands of Nauru and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. Here, in these cases, climate emergency occurs at the convergence of interrelated oppressions and social justice grievances, which, as in Indigenous perspectives, are impossible to pull apart. So whether targeting security services, tear gas, or pharmaceuticals, these actions expand our conception of emergency beyond narrow definitions of climate as a long-term averaging of weather patterns. Following from recent research around the double internalization of nature and capital in nature, producing what some call the Capitalist. For instance, Jason Moore. And Jason was presented here sometime recently, I think. Yeah? Maybe not. I thought I recognized him. Anyway, the Capitalist, the expanded climate names the irreducible entanglement of sociopolitical, economic, and environmental forces. So by extension, I'm going to argue that we have to think emergencies together. And you might recognize this piece from the exhibition, the Thomas Saraceno Spiderweb project. To think difference in emergency claims, it's crucial to parse the underlying assumptions of climate, particularly as it, and more broadly ecology, has been freighted with enormous complexity over the years. Does ecology connect organisms to environments in non-human habitats, leading to flourishing biodiversity when things go well, or catastrophic extinction when they don't? Or is ecology a complex arrangement of biogeophysical relationalities intersecting with socio-political and economic environments, possessing great capacity for inequality and violence, as well as justice and sustainability across human and non-human spectrums? In fact, it's increasingly difficult and even impossible to separate these understandings. And more, as the above examples indicate, one definition of emergency can easily conflict with others, overriding their own concerns, leading to tensions and even antagonisms between different iterations of politics, as when social justice activists dismiss climate concerns as irrelevant or privileged. Or on the other hand, when environmentalists claim social justice doesn't matter, ultimately, on a dead planet. These conflicts mirror inequalities between ethnic, racial, and class formations in the current highly fraught conditions of authoritarian capitalism, white supremacy, and institutional racism. To oppose these formations, we must resist rushing headlong into emergency politics without appreciating the implications. One useful proposal is to consider ecology as a mode of intersectionality. Historically, this is a method, especially in the US context, for thinking social oppressions, such as racial and gender-based oppressions, as irreducible and necessarily interconnected, drawing on traditions of anti-racist and anti-sexist activism within African American civil rights movements. Let's extend these connections further, I argue, to broader ecological entanglements. And this is, I'm referencing an essay that I recently published on the journal Panorama's website, which is a kind of a brief examination of what it means to think ecology as a mode of intersectionality. I'm hoping these terms aren't too difficult to translate into Russian. My apologies to the translators. What's at stake, as XR argues, is the very world we live in. But we have to ask what kind of world, and in defining emergency's subject, who will emerge from its rupture? Insofar as the term in English, emergency, and emergence are grammatically intertwined, we need to ask who will exist in the future. And conversely, who, including the more than human, might be defutured, right? Deprived of futurity. How might we look beyond emergency politics to cultivate emergent ecologies of multi-species flourishing, as much as social justice? This is no easy thing in the midst of a mass species extinction crisis, where extinction not only refers to the biological annihilation of non-humans, but also to a time when whole communities of people, including indigenous, migrant, impoverished, and minoritarian, are struggling for their very survival. In our era of ethno-nationalism and extractivism, what Wendy Brown calls apocalyptic populism and xenophobic exclusion, in which the future for all is hardly assured. Launched in the UK on October 31st, 2018, the movement Extinction Rebellion has quickly grown internationally as a nonviolent direct action environmentalist movement with, as of the summer, 650 groups in 45 countries, again, primarily in the UK, the EU, US, Australia, and New Zealand, but really all over the place, with roots in movements like Earth First and Occupy Democracy. Their theatrical protests and interventions, with members shutting down public streets and gluing themselves to government and corporate headquarters, struggle against what they understand as a civilization-ending existential threat. With its distinctive funereal aesthetics, building on the group ACT UP and their rebellious die-ins and political funerals against the HIV/AIDS crisis, particularly in the 1980s. XR joins the mourning for life's futurelessness to the militancy of massive direct action, aiming for an insurgent multi-species universality, which is ecological, socio-political, economic. And as accomplices, I want to argue we should support this movement by pushing to radicalize its analysis and its organization. So I want to just make that clear. I'm writing and trying to join this conversation in support ultimately of XR, even though I'm going to be, somewhat critical of their definition, as you'll see. So XR articulates three central demands, and these again are international. The first is tell the truth. Government must tell the truth by declaring a climate emergency. The second is act now. Government must act now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. And the third is beyond politics. Government must create and follow the decisions of a citizen assembly on matters of climate policy that affect everyone. Aiming for a big tent movement beyond political sectarianism and ideology, XR contends that we need to lay down our differences and find common ground. Part of XR's emergency is emergency's unacknowledged status, requiring emergency-producing action. Without it, we remain entranced within screen-obsessed consumerism or endless labor within precarious circumstances that allow no time for politics. In both cases, we continue down the path of biological annihilation, each of us becoming unconscious collaborators in the world's end. Thus, XR dedicates itself to an aesthetics of emergency, both exposing the ongoing destruction of climate disaster and challenging the concealment of emergency as a convergent crisis of denialist politics, media inattention, and corporate profiteering. They made a video, they make lots of videos, but one in 2019, earlier this year, features the band Radiohead and their song Idiotech, which highlights XR's typical tactics. So let me just play this video. It's a couple minutes long. We could talk a lot about that, but I'm going to move on to discuss some related matters. So XR's politicized aesthetics entails collective, as you saw in the video, collective action intervening in public spaces. In contrast, for instance, with some versions of rather conventional art institutional approaches built around individual and institutional practices that sometimes tend to depoliticize ecology, even while they usurp the greatest media visibility. Consider, for instance, in this vein, Olafur Eliasson's 2018 project Ice Watch, for which the artist collected 24 icebergs from Greenland's fjords, transported them to London, and placed them outside Tate Modern and the European headquarters of the billionaire Michael Bloomberg, who funded the project. Ice Watch coincided with the UN COP24 climate change conference in Katowice, Poland. And like XR, Eliasson cited the IPCC report on 12 more years. But whereas XR's interventionist approach with its participant activists has aimed to shut down the government corporate complex of petrocapitalism, Eliasson provided a conventional art exhibition in some ways, with a meditative opportunity for museum visitors to hear 10,000-year-old bubbles pop and fizzle as the ice melted by the touch of their hands, embodying individual complicity in global warming. Bloomberg said he hoped it would inspire new action on the climate, although Eliasson's, and this is my argument here, his limited conception of climate as an experiential matter of biogeophysical processes, largely divorced from economic and political causality, allowed no interrogation of his project's green neoliberal funding, which is symptomatic, I think, of much contemporary culture's climate politics, which is to address emergency without challenging dominant structures of power. Maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A. Yet XR is not without its own challenges. Its generalized collective we clearly resembles the false universalism that marks much of Anthropocene's species-scale discourse, which commonly invokes human activities as the central driver of environmental transformation, instead of the state-corporate military nexus of petrocapitalism. Okay, so the Anthropocene, I'm arguing, is in many ways a really problematic term. XR's beyond politics also ultimately limits the depth of its analysis, which has been already criticized as naively liberal and even inadvertently neocolonialist. Some of the most forceful challenges come from the climate justice group Wretched of the Earth. This is a UK-based climate justice organization, which finds XR's insurgency missing crucial insight into the economic structures that for centuries have pursued profit and domination across the world. For them and their extensive coalition, so this is a movement of movements of many different organizations, including diverse groups like Black Lives Matter UK, the environmentalist direct action movement Ende Gelände in Germany, and Redress South Africa. For them, the emergency lies not in the future, which invites historical amnesia, and that door needs some oil or something, but in a present marked by centuries-old violence. Similarly, foregrounding science, as XR does, science in the singular, overlooks the knowledges, experiences, and indeed sciences in the plural of indigenous communities struggling for generations. Wretched of the Earth writes, "Our communities have been on fire for a long time, and these flames are fanned by our silence and exclusion." So without expanded socio-ecological perspectives on climate, the obstacles grow. First, perhaps owing to XR's insensitivity to past colonial violence, in addition to foregrounding a rather depoliticized model of science. And it's important that the justice-oriented organization Science for the People, which is a really interesting international group of scientists, signed the open letter of Wretched of the Earth. It's important to point out that the movement's mass demonstrations tend to manifest weak and unrealistic demands without indicating the corresponding organizational work necessary to challenge capital's political economy. To suggest that civil disobedience will drive governments to willingly surrender political power to citizen assemblies acting against petrocapitalist interests instead of propelling them to further militarize police and criminalize protests, as has happened in the States in recent years, is improbable. It's even a fantasy of privilege blinded to the racist nature of much state violence. It's useful in this sense to return to the precedent of ACT UP. This is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in critically assessing XARS tactics. Formed in 1987 in New York City in the States, ACT UP practiced activist mourning, mourning being the processing of loss, dealing with the death of loved ones. So they practiced an activist mourning matched to clear political demands. While HIV/AIDS took on an increasingly precise epidemiology, rendering the body susceptible to opportunistic illnesses owing to compromised immunity, activists clearly recognized how it also transformed into a deadly epidemic, indeed an emergency, by political inaction and profiteering informed by institutional homophobia. Their die-ins consequently targeted symbolic sites of governmental and medical, media, and economic power with a boundless theater of rage. As the ACT UP member Douglas Crimp wrote, "The violence we encountered is relentless, the violence of silence and omission, almost as impossible to endure as the violence of unleashed hatred and outright murder. Because this violence also desecrates the memories of our dead, we rise in anger to vindicate them. In such moments of socio-ecological entanglement, mourning becomes militancy." Compared to ACT UP, XARS street theater can suggest funerals without a body, where the mourning for abstract categories like our future not only erases emergencies of the past, but also neglects causes in the past and present. Plus, it makes emotional engagement difficult. Even the mourning for an extinct species or a non-human environmental object is hard-pressed, given the lack of established cultural rituals that would lend it meaning. And here I'm thinking, for instance, of the recent funeral that was held in Iceland for Ökjökull, which is the first glacier to be lost to climate change. And according to scientists, this will be the fate of all glaciers worldwide in the next 200 years. So perhaps one significance of XR is to fashion funeral protocol for more than humans in the apocalyptic age of extinction. Without radical specific demands, though, XR's emergency is open to appropriation by green capitalism, and this is where this becomes an enormous problem. Not surprisingly, while many countries have declared climate emergencies, they're typically non-binding, like the UK's, likely in an effort to manage XR's disruptions. Meanwhile, entrepreneurs and politicians the world over are more than happy to declare climate emergencies, but in support of techno-fixes and geoengineering and market-based mechanisms, decarbonization technologies, and de-radicalized Green New Deal frameworks, which, even if they did work, would do nothing to intervene in the ongoing catastrophes of impoverishment, colonial oppression, racial violence, which for many are inextricable parts of present and ongoing emergency. Recall XR's language of net zero emissions. This is a code word emerging out of World Bank policy, which doesn't mean zero emissions, but rather stands for carbon capture technology, supported by many of the above these green capitalist initiatives, eager to unlock billions and even trillions in state research and development funding if a climate emergency can be declared. So divestment, financial divestment from fossil fuels is a big part of the climate movement worldwide. But of course, if we divest, there are also calls to reinvest in a post-carbon economy, right? So some people have estimated trillions of euros or dollars at stake here. It's a massive economic possibility for investors. So indeed, according to extensive research on the manufacturing of Greta Thunberg, right, the teenage Swedish activist who's doing a lot of work right now to assist the project of getting a climate emergency declared worldwide. So according to lots of research that I've been reading on Greta Thunberg as a mega influencer, often against her own climate justice message, by the nonprofit industrial complex, including groups like XARS and the World Wildlife Federation, Greenpeace, and Al Gore, the US vice president from a few years ago, his Climate Reality Project, who are working in tandem with rather anti-democratic startups, tech startups, and soft power social media machines like WeDon'tHaveTime.com. This is a climate revolution in name only, and the said emergency has nothing to do with the protection of our Earth or climate, and never will, according to arguments, right? Rather, it has everything to do with saving, protecting, and expanding the capitalist economy at the expense of our already decimated planet. Okay, so that's really the big argument here. When declaring an emergency, whose emergency? And the dangers of having that emergency appropriated by the dominant political economy is the real danger here. Okay, but worse still, this is another danger, is that emergency demands might transform into states of exception, currently abused, as we know, in the US, in Israel, in Brazil, in the Philippines, here in Russia, the Sudan, and many other countries. Following the US bombing of Iraq in 2003, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben warned that the state of exception is becoming the norm, realized through the erosion of civil liberties and the suspension of democratic constitutions, the negation of government accountability, the militarization of police, the criminalization of protest, and the impunity of state violence. These conditions have arguably only worsened in our current era of authoritarian populism, joining environmental natalism, right, the support for those who are born within one's ethnic community, environmental natalism, and anti-migrant xenophobia to deadly effect. With near-future predictions of a substantial increase in climate migration by 2050, states will likely continue to instrumentalize emergencies to intensify military response to environmental insecurity. This logic is already driving the international response to migration, for instance, on the US-Mexico border, with the construction of concentration camps, full-spectrum border surveillance, and maximized defense capabilities, along with the criminalization of migrant aid efforts. So people, for instance, who leave bottles of water for migrants in the desert are being criminalized. Like people who are rescuing migrants in the Mediterranean Sea, for instance, all directed at people suffering a climate emergency caused by centuries of colonial intervention, imperialist foreign policy, and capitalist extraction. During an earlier fascist emergency, during World War II, Walter Benjamin famously argued for a new conception of history to contest the seeming inevitability of the present. He wrote, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it's our task to bring about a real state of emergency. And this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism." That's from his theses on the philosophy of history. His words ring true once again today. But how to mobilize emergency remains a key question when collective futurability, designating our collective ability to create new futures alternative to the now, or our capacity to decolonize what's to come, beginning with an emancipatory imagination, is increasingly precarious under conditions of capitalist realism and algorithmic governance. But what if we begin by acknowledging, against XR's dark prophecies that perform the death of the future, that catastrophe lies not in what's to come, but in what's been and is still here. Indigenous peoples, for instance, are post-apocalyptic, as Nick Estes observes. This is his recently published book on the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle in the US, an indigenous uprising against oil infrastructure in North Dakota. He writes, "Our worlds have been destroyed already in many ways, and we're trying to rebuild them and reclaim them and reestablish correct relations. The severity of the situation, though, shouldn't undermine the willingness to act. That is, even as water protectors were submitted to chemical weapons in these attacks of police brutality during their protests." In this regard, it's crucial that XR USA adds a fourth dimension to their demands, the demands of Extinction Rebellion, which is unique internationally, but really important, and moves its formation toward a climate justice position. The fourth demand is that we demand a just transition that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and indigenous sovereignty, establishes reparations and remediation led by and for Black people, indigenous people, people of color, and poor communities for years of environmental injustice, establishes legal rights for ecosystems to thrive and regenerate in perpetuity, and repairs the effects of ongoing ecocide to prevent extinction of human and all species in order to maintain a livable, just planet for all. So I think that is a demand that I think is really a crucial addition to XR and makes it a movement that we can get behind. It also shows how XR is evolving, negotiating its emergency claims via an intersectionalist political ecology. Without it, we risk a paradoxical radical liberalism, radical in direct action, but liberal in superficial analysis, as XR potentially performs its own death, producing spectacles of protest only to catalyze counterinsurgency as the state of exception takes command. Let me explain what that means. Moving on to my second example of cultural, artistic, and activist practice. The 9 weeks of art and action was organized by the collective called Decolonized This Place earlier this year in New York City, offering a totally different approach to climate emergency. Described as an action-oriented movement centering around indigenous struggle, Black liberation, free Palestine, global wage workers, and degentrification, DTP's action targeted the Whitney Museum in New York City, the trustee and Safariland Corporation's CEO, Warren Kanders, who's an arms manufacturer and conflict profiteer, whose tear gas products have been used in Ferguson, in Missouri, in the USA, against Black Lives Matter protesters, on the US-Mexico border by US border agents against migrants, and in the occupied territories by the Israeli Defense Forces against Palestinians. All are environments defined by the repressive convergence of militarized states and chemical weapons. Exactly the dystopian eventuality of emergency become state of exception that I mentioned earlier. In 2008, DTP unfurled an all-out campaign of tactical media, agitprop design, Instagram feeds, and various self-authorized collective actions in the museum spaces. These were in coordination with other groups, including the radical pacifist organization War Resisters League, already engaged in long-term struggle against Safariland. Safariland is a really egregious, really problematic term in English. The idea of a safari, where you go to, for instance, Africa to look at wild animals is, this is a kind of neo-colonial activity of tourism. So, but to call a corporation Safari Land is really surprising in this day and age. DTP's militant media also riffed off the art of Whitney's temporary exhibitions, partly funded by Candors, including its ongoing Andy Warhol show, mirroring the pop artist's appropriation aesthetic, specifically the latter's Death in America series, while redirecting the iconography toward their political intervention. So we move from pop art to agitprop. The serial images of museum spectacle showing Candors on the right, his wife and the fellow Whitney Museum trustee Allison Candors standing with the Whitney director Adam Weinberg, are punctured by the representational proximity to tear gas canisters used in oppressive police and military actions, revealing the disastrous intertwinement of contemporary power and culture in the era of carceral capitalism, military neoliberalism, and apocalyptic populism. A shared technique in all these formations is the weaponization of the environment, what Peter Sloterdijk terms atmoterrorism, stretching from Auschwitz to the World Trade Center attacks, enjoining the atmosphere to juridico-political, economic, and medical frameworks. It's completely different, in other words, from the supposedly benevolent contribution to social order defended by the likes of Candors. As Anna Feigenbaum writes in her extensive study of tear gas, in both its physical design and its application throughout history, tear gas is for the control of economically, politically, and socially vulnerable populations, enforced by mentalities and behaviors of constantly reworked white supremacy, where riot control is and always has been the business of protecting the wealth of a tiny minority. As such, emergency is a matter of life or death in the deep historical now of oppressive border zones, criminalized protest, institutional racism, settler colonialism, and military aggression, as climate emergency becomes climate control. Climate's emergency, in other words, refers not so much in this sense to carbon in the atmosphere, as with XR and many other environmentalist groups, but rather to powers on the ground. And it's with that framework in mind that we see that narrowly defined terminologies of climate emergency remain both too abstract and more reflective of ecologies of affluence, which may themselves, as we've seen, perpetuate sometimes inadvertently oppression. In this regard, tear gas's climate emergency resonates for me with what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney term socio ecology. They write that in their book, The Undercommons, they write that modernity's constitution in the transatlantic slave trade, in settler colonialism, and capital's emergence in and with the state is the socio-ecological disaster. In addition, it recalls Christina Sharp's notion of anti-blackness as total climate. These positions avoid XR's beyond political ecology of atmospheric carbon. And similarly, DTP, Decolonized This Place's emergency, is indissociable from the ongoingness of historically enacted disaster, where climate change, in its narrow definition, erases the existence of that long-standing catastrophe rather than rebelling against it. And this is, I think, also where exhibitions like this one at the Garage really usefully expand that narrow understanding of climate or ecology right into multiple different discourses and practices. This is really crucial to avoid what might be called the reductiveness or essentialization of climate change discourse, which is just about carbon in the atmosphere. One might think, just one more word on this term socio ecology. This is I think a really important intervention because it insists on putting ecology, which often is thought as a matter of nature that's out there, and insists on connecting it to the social and the technological, the political and economic, and arguing that they can't be pulled apart. Right? That's the intersectionality of socio ecology that I want to really build on and connect to and build my analysis in relationship to. So one might think that tear gas is more biopolitics than environmental concern. Like preemptive policing or surveillance or kettling or counterinsurgency armaments, tear gas as one more technology of crowd management. It hypes safety, but enacts repression. As a performative aesthetics of physiological persuasion, it distributes the sensible according to chemical agents that divide bodies in space. So tear gas, I'm trying to expand the analysis here, is a kind of aesthetics. And in this sense, the police or the military are the ones who are choreographing spatial arrangements that are deeply political and unequal, right? But as a substance that joins weaponized atmospheres to bodily control, it creates biochemical environments that compel behavioral adaptation to regimes of power. As such, it's more than biopolitical. It's climatological. It's geontopolitical. It's socio-ecological. Right? It's intersectionalist. Insofar as Safariland forms part of a global regime of climate control that weaponizes the environment to the detriment of all but a tiny minority, the Kanders case elicits timely concerns about political ecology more broadly and the transformation of contemporary art in the era of climate emergency more specifically. Unlike the atmospheric carbon associated with mainstream climate change discourse, with its generalized complicity and globalized effects, right? Where we're told repeatedly that we're all in this together. It affects everyone. It's everyone's concern. And we're all in some way, one way or another, complicit because we're all dependent on the fossil fuel economy, right? There's a universality that ends up denying forms of political traction and antagonism. So unlike that model, tear gas possesses a clear agent of oppression with targeted differential impacts aimed at specific populations. Its calculus of causality offers something important then to climate change discourse. So what I want to ask, what if we situate tear gas as the exemplary medium of climate emergency instead of carbon? One consequence is that climate change can no longer be considered accidental and universal. Rather, it's precisely instrumentalized in the interests of power. It thereby reveals the stark inequalities hidden under UN climate change negotiations, say, when delegates negotiate over limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. A seemingly technocratic calculation, but which ultimately represents, according to the Sudanese climate negotiator Lumumba Dieping, it represents climate genocide. When disproportionate warming in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, is taken into account. So the argument here briefly, and you can follow this up if you're interested, it's a forensic architecture case study, is that there's no such thing as 2 degrees Celsius warming, because some areas of the Earth will warm to 5 or 6 degrees, other areas 1 or 2 degrees. So, and that is predictable. So we know what will warm more than other areas. So sub-Saharan Africa, according to Dieping, will burn in the future. This is the argument that he's making. Similarly, when the UN reports on the alarming rates of extinction, threatening a quarter of all Earth species, and blames so-called human activities, we know, thanks to tear gas, that it's really a small minority of wealthy, powerful people and the corporations and governments that they influence who possess disproportionate culpability and who continue to benefit. This is a photograph of an owl on a beach in LA, which has escaped the wildfires that are consuming California last year. And when the Amazon burns, we can focus on the agro-industrial extractivism laying waste to the rainforest, continuing the 500-year-long project of colonial domination where ecocide meets genocide. Tear gas, like any greenhouse gas, is a medium of structural debility, rooted in the ongoingness of colonial violence and extractive capital. If tear gas best exemplifies the political ecology of climate change as a form of climate control, then Gaza is its limit case. Indeed, under the IDF's, the Israeli Defense Forces' militarized occupation, Gaza operates as an experimental lab for the production, maintenance, and profitability of biopolitical debilitation, as Jasbir Puar argues. Meaning that Israel's management of water and soil, air, food imports measured to precise, minimal nutritional requirements, and the control of mobility in this open-air prison exemplifies colonial occupation as total climate control. Within the late stage of this longest military occupation in modern history, Israel commonly claims to be practicing humanitarian war, in which it retains the so-called right to maim, in other words, the right to injury, not to kill, as a less than lethal exercise of power, by shooting nonviolent protesters, for instance, in the legs, instead of shooting to kill, where withholding death becomes an act of dehumanization. The Palestinians, Jasbir Puar argues, are not even human enough for death. The goal is twofold: to physically disable political resistance, often leading to lifelong injuries, and to commodify disaster through cycles of destruction and reconstruction, including buildings and infrastructure, privatized healthcare services, securitization and militarization, where the right to maim generates a profitable right to repair. As an ecology of disaster capitalism, where space is continually reproduced in the interests of environmental inequality, we confront injured bodies without a funeral, but with a bill. As such, the occupation possesses its own Crono Politics, a politics of time, that is part of an extended state of emergency, technically in operation since 1948. With the founding of Israel, where the ongoing production of catastrophe guarantees a desired future. Jasbir Puar's term for this, in her book, The Right to Maim, is what she calls prehensive futurity, according to which the state makes the present look exactly the way it needs to, as catastrophic, in order to guarantee a very specific and singular outcome in the future, one dependent on Israeli interests, generating the permanent debilitation of settler colonialism. When taking into account the ecocidal use of white phosphorus and depleted uranium with a half-life of 4.5 billion years, both used in IDF operations, as is documented in another forensic architecture analysis, we confront a weaponized epigenetics of toxic inhuman futurity, which is a mode of climate control extending into incomprehensible time. Not surprisingly, Gaza's anti-colonial protests are no Extinction Rebellion, and in fact there are no such formations in Palestine, only in Israel, revealing, I think, the privileged and even neocolonial basis of XARS climate emergency when detached from a climate justice-based framework. Although that's not to say that Extinction Rebellion also will be submitted to the conditions of toxic warfare as they were gassed in France earlier this year. So rather than a rebellion against extinction, recent Gaza uprisings define a rebellion against something arguably worse, a rebellion against capitalist biopolitical debilitation within a carefully managed and seemingly endless climate emergency. So the added point here is that we need to pay attention to this, not only out of solidarity and political engagement, but also because as a kind of experimental laboratory, these conditions stand to be globalized, and in fact they are already being adopted within different areas of the world, right? This is the kind of future, this is one potential future that we have to confront and oppose, right? In solidarity with those uprisings in Gaza, Decolonized displaces coalitionist practice. Part of its 9 weeks of art in action brings out a further dimension of ecology as a mode of intersectionality. Avoiding the limits of identity politics associated sometimes with intersectionality, which end up in a kind of a separatist essentialism. The radical dimension of its interconnected struggles, including these various groups, which I highlight this because I think it's really interesting and important to see how let's say the becoming activist of aesthetics is increasingly becoming grounded also in social movements. So this formation draws on the power of solidarity as the necessary basis for alliance building, practicing what the African-American Black Panther member, Angela Davis, terms the indivisibility of justice. Tear gas in its negative cast figures precisely also as a materiality of oppression, chemically linking diverse geographies of violence and rendering their grievances interconnected. Feigenbaum points out how tear gas is typically used against environmentalists, people of color, the poor, LGBTQ activists, refugees, migrants, the disabled, the mentally unwell, young people, and dissidents. And in this regard, we can make sense of DTP's slogan that they amplified in a banner drop, unauthorized, on the top of the Whitney Museum. When we breathe together. What I would call an intersectionalist climate justice politics, put to task against the environmental injustice of violent policing, uneven toxicity, and structural debility alike. So DTP's aesthetics of urgency, which is collective, instrumental, grounded in social movement struggle, is not necessarily opposed to art, but rather places art's conventional forms as commodified objects of autonomous individual creativity that's original and rarefied under erasure. As they write, what if we strike art? Like what if we have a strike, like as workers strike? So what if we strike art to liberate art from itself? Not to end art, but to free it from the circuits of capital, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and debt, and to unleash its powers to imagine that which is not immediately present. And what if we reject the specialization of activism? We choose a never-ending process of experimentation and questioning. Or we choose, as the Zapatistas say, to make the path by walking. Let art be training in the practice of decolonial freedom. Another ally in the 9 weeks of art in action and the broader anti-candors campaign is forensic architecture. This is the multidisciplinary research group based in London that uses architectural techniques to investigate state violence around the world. And I'll just mention that the work of Susan Shupley is in the exhibition here, and she's involved in forensic architecture. She did a piece on Chernobyl in the exhibition. Invited to participate in the biennial just as the anti-candors campaign was gaining ground, they contributed a video-based investigation of Safariland Group and Sierra Bullets, parented by Claris Corporation, where Candor serves as the executive chairman. This is their website, which you can check out if you're interested. Their 10-minute piece called Triple Chaser named after the Safariland tear gas product, offers another entrance to emergency politics and climate control. The video offers documentary footage of life and death situations of state violence in various geographies of conflict, including U.S. border security using triple chaser tear gas grenades against migrants, Turkish police firing tear gas grenades on Gezi Park protesters in 2013, and Israeli snipers using open-tip match-king bullets to shoot Palestinians at the Gaza border during the 2018 Great March of Return protests, when the IDF killed 154 civilian protesters, including 35 children, and wounded more than 6,000 people, according to FA's analysis, Forensic Architecture. Triple chaser grenades typically release CS gas, first synthesized in the US in 1928, developed for military use and first prototyped in the US war in Vietnam during the 1950s and 60s. According to the International Agreed Chemical Weapons Convention of 1997, tear gas is prohibited for use in warfare, so it's prohibited in use for warfare, but this restriction doesn't apply to domestic policing all over the world, which is why it's used all over the world. If tear gas indeed reveals the truth of climate control, which I'm arguing it does, it functions as the executive branch of petrocapitalism. It's revealing to note then that its active ingredient is a cyanocarbon, which is derived from hydrocarbons, the organic components of oil and gas. During the video narrated by the musician and Talking Heads singer David Byrne, we learn that triple chaser grenades are sold around the world. Not surprisingly, Candor's business skyrocketed after 9/11, 2001, as militarization and the privatization of violence responded to the structural crises of liberal democracy, capital accumulation, and resource extraction during the early 21st century. For Feigenbaum, arms manufacturers like Candor's strike a careful balance between selling pain and promising harmlessness. But this fantasy of humanitarian non-lethality, deployed so as not to kill, satisfying human rights concerns according to a logic of lesser evilism, can in reality, as we saw earlier, be far worse. A central part of FA's project involved training a computer learning algorithm to visually recognize triple chaser grenades for future use as a juridico-political check against state violence anywhere in the world. To do so, FA created a synthetic training data set to teach the classifier, resulting in a remarkable video sequence of machine learning visuality containing seemingly infinite options of colored backgrounds, as you see here in one still, with which to test and improve the classifier's recognition capabilities, played under a disjunctive soundtrack of mid-20th century vocal and orchestral music. The commentary explains the musical selection, noting that in 2016, Candor's gave $2.5 million to the Aspen Music Festival. This is a music festival in Colorado in the States, which renamed its Sunday concert series in his honor, inaugurating it with a performance of the 4 last songs by the German composer Richard Strauss. This is a recent website, homepage of the music festival. And again, this is funded by Warren B. Candor's and Safariland. I thought it was striking that this is about a music series inspired by nature. As with Candor's Whitney, culture, in this case, functions as a machine for transforming profiteering militarist brutality into virtuous philanthropy. But the audiovisual juxtaposition offers a reverse tactic of what we might call de-art washing, where culture is shockingly reunited with the oppressive technology serving as its condition of possibility. Over this complex montage, the narration describes triple chaser's potential physiological effects, so all the different kinds of medical problems that you can have if you inhale tear gas, based on Safariland's safety guidance in an analytic deadpan worthy of the filmmaker Haroon Farooqi. So let me play a 2-minute clip of this part of the video. You can find the whole video online. It's open access.
Safariland Safety Guidance provides the following information to doctors. Severe allergic skin reaction, bronchial spasms, and anaphylactic shock are possible. Irritant to eyes. Irritant to skin and mucous membranes. Breathing difficulty. Disorientation. Danger. Danger of blast or crush-type injuries. Danger of pulmonary edema. Danger of disturbed cardiac rhythm. Danger of convulsion. Danger of impaired breathing. Danger of cerebral edema.
So that's Strauss's Spring from 1948, based on a poem of Hermann Hesse, and was written in the last years of the composer's life in the apocalyptic wake of the Nazi Holocaust and World War II. In the video passage that we just saw, the tear-worthy sonic pathos of the music paradoxically confronts the deathliness, or perhaps the uncanny deathlessness, of AI's post-humanist immortality, right? Artificial intelligence's post-humanist immortality, glimpsed through sequential imaging that combines inhuman speed, just the quickness of the images, and seemingly endless repetition, reminiscent in some ways of the disjunctive temporalities of the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Itself combining AI threats to humanity amidst futurist space exploration and encounters with alien technology, also with a Strauss score. In this sense, we can understand Triple Chaser as mediating the fears of a triple extinction, an emergency appropriate to our own era. And this is my argument or speculation here, but the first extinction threat that we can discern in that video is the ethnic destruction enacted through colonial violence, geared toward the socially oppressed, as well as inspiring paranoid fantasies of ethnic replacement. And we're hearing a lot about this, for instance, in the US and Europe, the imagined threat of a near future white genocide. This is in extremely reactionary ethno-nationalist discourse. Second, species extinction owing to climate catastrophe, exemplified by weaponized environments. And third, the ultimate surpassing of humanity by AI, what Franco Bifo Berardi terms for AI a frozen immortality that emerges in the form of a global cognitive automaton, as it comes to recognize repeatedly tear gas as a weapon of mass destruction. In each case, the dying confront tear gas's cruel irony of forcing a lacrimogenic self-mourning, a compelled crying, in the act of experiencing one's own annihilation. FA's video concludes by stating, "We shared our findings with the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, who served Sierra Bullets with legal notice, warning that the exports of their bullets to Israel may be aiding and abetting war crimes." As much as one might support this grievance claim, it remains insufficient, I think, in bringing accusations of human rights violations and war crimes to a European non-governmental organization lacking the capacity to enact justice, which can at most file criminal cases in European courts, but without jurisdiction or extradition powers in relation to Israel or the US. In addition, by focusing on corporate malpractice, abetting oppressive regimes, this kind of liberal grievance claims neglects to oppose tear gas as used in any context whatsoever. And the danger there is in neutralizing more radical social movement opposition, which possesses the more ambitious political horizon of the structural transformation of governance itself. Plus, for some, maiming is a human rights abuse, but for others, it guarantees profits. In this case, Decolonized displaces actions are ever more necessary. Its opposition not limited to institutional critique, but advancing the decolonization of life in general. Not that the approaches of FA and DTP are mutually exclusive. Indeed, they're allied. And no doubt we need both, and all others that can aid in the process of emancipation from the very system that allows for the existence of war profiteer philanthropists and oppressive states claiming the right to maim. We must move, in other words, from emergency to emergence, of the new and the not yet, making a just transition into the future, where the not yet is based in the already here, grounded in the traditions of the oppressed. All right, I'm going to finish up with this short conclusion now. Following the coordinated, sustained actions of groups like DTP, Kanders did resign in July of this year, just a couple months ago. But DTP's project exceeds this one goal, their movement forming part of a much broader project of what they call institutional liberation, based on the ongoing project of decolonization, opposed, in their words, to the entire settler institutional nexus of art, capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. To that end, we must decolonize ecology and climate as terms limited by the politico-economic frameworks of late capitalism, understanding them instead, as I'm arguing, as inexorably intersectionalist, as matters of socio ecology and climate control. As we've seen, emergency is easily instrumentalized toward purposes other than democratic equality and social justice, while a radical version of the Green New Deal, premised on the structural turn toward renewable energy, guided by equality with the integral participation of frontline communities, may very well be our best global hope at addressing climate catastrophe, and I agree with this. It too is inadequate if it does not also support decolonization as an integral part of its agenda. In other words, just declaring emergency on its own is no politics at all. Addressing this necessary connection between climate emergency and decolonial social justice, the Indigenous historian and activist Nick Estes, who I mentioned earlier, asks, why is it easier for some to imagine the end of fossil fuels, but not settler colonialism? Indeed, to envision green economics and wind turbine and solar power utopias and the end of colonial oppression are both necessary. That's the point of alliance building, and this can only happen by forming a green socialism from below, built on the bedrock of class politics and multi-species justice, dedicated to new forms of life beyond capitalist exploitation, social inequality, and climate apocalypse. Ultimately, to organize, right, to develop new organs, to organize, is to develop capacity, including the capacity to answer the violence of climate control that is already upon us. Like the organized tear gas brigades in Hong Kong's recent uprisings, who used traffic cones and bottled water to douse the chemical weapons fired at them. And they're inspired by Bruce Lee. Be water, my friend. Right? His philosophy is inspiring new strategies of emancipation. So in order to envision a future in which we will all be liberated from the root causes of the climate crisis, capitalism, extractivism, racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and other systems of oppression, the climate movement must reflect the complex realities of everyone's lives in their narrative, rights wretched of the earth. As such, we must certainly decolonize this place, and this and that one too, creating a transnational network of resistance capable of overcoming the transnational power of capital. But we must also decolonize our future, rescuing it from the disaster of green capitalist and worse, eco-fascist inevitability or seeming inevitability, facilitated by an irresponsible emergency politics. Thank you.
Дорогие друзья, у нас осталось несколько минут,
Dear
буквально
friends,
2-3 вопроса.
we have
Вы
some
можете
time
поднять руку,
left
мы
for 2
передадим
or
вам
3
микрофон.
questions, and I'll hand over the microphone for your questions.
Okay.
So
take a shower.
thank you for this presentation. Just imagine how it's difficult to be Greta or Alexandra or even more you in this country where more than 60% of GDP produced by oil and gas companies. I see a beautiful sticker on your laptop, Save the Arctic, with the logo of Shell. It's really difficult to think about art in this situation in our country when democracy is more important than climate at all. Could you shortly recommend us something how, for example, owners of these resources, our companies, big companies, chemicals company, can help society in this situation? Maybe according to your experience in art.
Sure, thank you for that question. You raised a number of points that I'm thinking about already. One is that, in the states where I'm based, there's also an enormous fossil fuel economy. And in institutions that I work with and work for, like the University of California, these are all invested in the fossil fuel economy in lots of ways, including in pension funds, for instance, my pension fund. It's important to acknowledge from the start that we're all implicated, we're all involved in this, and that's really crucial to be honest about, to acknowledge those contradictions and to try to work within them. Right, that's what we have to do. That's the challenge, is to work within them. So I'm again trying to identify some political antagonisms or contradictory elements, forces of contradiction that we need to be aware of when we're thinking about declaring a climate emergency. And so I think it's really important what you said, that democracy itself may be more urgent in some contexts than thinking about the climate. And part of my argument is that, we need to think these together, right? We can't just think about carbon in the atmosphere or future climate catastrophe without also taking into account democratic conditions. Just to make that even more clear, speaking of my own situation in the U.S., to listen to a group like Extinction Rebellion, as much as I agree with much of what they're arguing, the proposal that we demand that government that government declare a climate emergency, when we're talking about a government that's profoundly undemocratic, it makes absolutely no sense, right? So I think we need to start there and do that work of attempting to develop more complex and embodied, engaged, and locally specific types of collective practices to engage in the situation. When it comes to people who are very wealthy and leaders of our economic order and asking what they can do, I personally, and here a little bit as an activist, I would say that's not the right question, because I think we're past the point of asking them to save us, right? This is about joining the ranks of the tradition, like what I'm calling after Benjamin, the traditions of the oppressed. This is where the real movements lie, and I think we're not going to win a way out by asking people who are in power to save us. We have to demand, we have to challenge the structures of power as they exist.
Thank you for the lecture. Can you explain how to act in a world with full of contradiction? Because, for example, Chinese government with quite oppressive and non-democratic now invests more than the West into climate research, and now has a climate program which is bigger than the West's. Here in Russia, Putin just announced that Russia will jump on a climate agenda, that Russia is warming 2.5 times faster than the rest of the world. So now government would be pro-climate, and how to say, this argument would be taken from opposition. So how to act on that situation when, how to say, we are on different sides of the equation?
Yeah, it's really it's impossible to understate the complexity and difficulty of the situation that we're in, I think, and in my own practice and thinking about this, we can only do what we can from whatever situation that we find ourselves in. So I think it's really crucial, urgent to develop locally based collective social movements that are dealing with the singularity of specific, like, geopolitical or economic contexts, and do the work toward democratization that can also lead toward forms of much needed transition toward a post-carbon or post-fossil fuel economy, but will do so by foregrounding social justice concerns, equality, democratization, transparency, accountability. I think this is a really one of the key takeaways, I would hope, from my presentation, is that's what we really need to be doing. How do we do that? I'm not sure what needs to be done here or in other contexts. In the one that I'm based, it's very important to deal with specific institutions to join the climate emergency and the upcoming climate strike. And by the one, there's one that's been called, that's international, beginning September 20th, right? To join the climate strike. But to do so by grounding it in local, regional politics that can be hopefully scaled up at some point. But I think, it's absolutely urgent to develop ways of self-governance, of autonomy, of struggles that can take over and challenge the corrupt political institutions that dominate many parts of the world. And we can only do that beginning locally and regionally, I think, at least speaking from my background. So that means in Santa Cruz, California, there's representatives of Wells Fargo. This is a really important bank that funds a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure. Amazon, that provides logistics and communication infrastructure for border security that is targeting migrants coming from climate-stressed areas. And Google, as a corporation with a lot of power that funds climate denial conferences in the US. So those are three corporations that we're targeting in the upcoming climate emergency crisis in Santa Cruz, California. That's just where we are, responding to the urgencies that exist from our analysis. But I think that's what's crucial. That's what everyone needs to do. I'm not sure what that entails exactly in different contexts, but this is the kind of discussion that I think we need to have and establish forms of transnational solidarity on that basis.
Thank you for this thought-provoking lecture. I think that most of what we've discussed already is linked to activist campaigns, as you said, and more of a political implications, economic implications. And I have this question related to contemporary art. What do you see today as the agency of contemporary art in this agenda, if you see it at all? Maybe it should step away and bring voices and give voices to different other creative forms of activities, or maybe even disappear for some time.
Yeah, this is another really complex question that I'm getting. I've been getting this question also, or different iterations of it, and I'm trying to make an effort. I suppose with this presentation, there's a risk of creating an opposition between social movement activism versus artistic practice. But I hope I'm trying to avoid that, right? But I am really interested in this kind of activist social movement-based practice. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of possibilities for more individual, speculative, imaginative, aesthetic investigations of all sorts of questions that relate to ecology and climate and the expanded definition. So I think it's perfect to be talking during this exhibition here because there's lots of instances of this if you look around in this show. These do tend, though, to be smaller scale, the speculative and the imaginative, the poetic. These kind of frameworks they're not really addressing an emergency political demand, though. With this presentation, that's what I'm really concerned with. And I don't know what you meant to imply that they might need to go away. But perhaps we're seeing, again, if we're entering into this a real global crisis. It's undeniable that we're in a mass species extinction event. We haven't seen one for 65 million years on Earth, right? This is an unprecedented catastrophe that we're facing. So it's not surprising in that context that we would see the radical transformation of what art means. I think. So that's true. I think there's a structural transformation that's ongoing where aesthetics, say the broader sphere of creativity that is entering into forms of sensibility, is exiting the privileged boundaries of the art institution and is being taken up in all sorts of ways and directed toward political transformation. So I'm really interested in that. But there's also a lot of speculative proposals that I think are really more urgent than ever as well. Because that was also a big part of my presentation. Like, we have to be wary of this demand to think only in an emergency temporality, because then it tends to debilitate us. It creates a non-historical engagement with the present. It's a very restricted existential condition. And I think the speculative, imaginative horizon of artistic practices, when they're compelling, can be really crucial in terms of providing some sensibility for a future possibility that may not exist or may only exist under very oppressed circumstances in the present. So I think that's really crucial. I'm really interested in radical futurisms. How can we cultivate futurity that is different from capitalist realism, but futurities that are grounded in social justice and multi-species ecologies. And that's where imaginative artistic practices I think are really interesting and important.
Good evening, and thanks for your ideas for spreading. So here I think we are all concerned in environmental problems, well, at least most of us, but we all know that there are people who are starving more from, who are troubled more about starving problems. And when you're literally starved, you can't think about what's happening with plastic, like in 10,000 kilometers from you. And here in Russia, we have this economical situation when we are banned from all society discussions, international discussions about economics, politics, and environmental problems. And as well, we have these environmental troubles inside Russia. So, in your opinion, what do you think? How can simple person and all society and simple people talk to government, and how can government help them, even if we have when we have such problems as not having working places, wide wealth gap, and etc. And some people in Russia think that environmental problems are third level problems, not like the first one.
Right. Well, just to, I think, restate some of the things that I've been saying. One is that we have to, part of the reason why people can think of environment as not so urgent or a privileged concern or whatever is the way it's defined or delimited. And that, I think that we need to challenge those narrow definitions of climate. So, you know, we have to talk about climates of democracy or climates of equality, climates of participation and inclusivity within the governing of forms of life. And I'm trying to do that through this kind of work, through teaching, through my relation to activism, through amplifying our artistic and activist practices that are doing that as well. I think, you know, like that's the only thing we can do. But we again, like what you're saying about the context here is not limited to this place, right? It's also, again, in the US, we're facing, I think, also a crisis of belief in possibility of political transformation at all these days. And many people, including many people who are very political, have kind of collectively agreed that challenging politics at the national level today is no longer really possible. Instead, we have to work locally. We have to try to re-establish forms of accountability and responsibility between people in their communities and local political representatives. And that can be really difficult to do, especially when you don't have histories of trust and belief in accountability, that people will represent your interests or represent interests in a way that support the claim for equality or lessening the extremes of inequality. So I think that's really crucial. I quoted Nick Estes, again, the Indigenous historian and activist, and he said we have to, Indigenous people have survived the apocalypse, and we're trying to rebuild our worlds, partly by reestablishing what he said, correct relations. And what is a correct relation? I didn't really elaborate on that point, but a correct relation is living in balance with your environment so that we're not, killing everything or polluting everything or spreading plastic toxicity all over the world. Those are incorrect relations. But correct relations are also between people in terms of believing in them, trusting them, having faith in them, believing in the kind of mutuality, respect, and support that we can establish within communities. I think that's really in profound crisis these days, especially when you factor in categories of race and gender, sexuality in different contexts, right? So what can simple people do? I think, again, we have to try to build from the ground up correct relations and to try to create the conditions of life that we want to live in before we demand immediate emergency action on, and solve global warming, for instance. How can we do that when we don't even have governments that we believe in?
Thank you.
Thank you.